Well, this week, the prophet Isaiah gives us some more familiar poetry. One of them we read on Monday, the Feast on the Mountain. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. We often read that on Easter, the chief feast day of the year, a day for rich food and well-aged wines strained clear. There's a line in the poem that has a particular memory. He will swallow up death forever. Now, Hebrew doesn't have tense as you and I think of it, so some translations read, he has swallowed up death forever. I was reading that one Easter. I read, he has swallowed up death forever, and a young girl in the congregation blurted out, how did he do that? If I'd been preaching the sermon that day, I may have started there. Another familiar piece in this week's reading is in chapter 35, the song about the Holy Way. It is the way for God's people who return to Zion, a way of celebration and of safety. It concludes with a beautiful assurance, sorrow and sighing shall flee away. The bulk of this week's reading will be judgment, promise, and political commentary. There is a lot of political commentary in the portion of Isaiah we read this week, especially with respect to foreign policy. Once again, folks who say that the church should not say anything about politics are simply asking us to ignore the Bible. Well, most people wish we would ignore the Bible, especially the parts they disagree with. Isaiah had a very strong message from God about how Judah should relate to foreign powers, especially Egypt. And in chapter 28, you will read God's judgment on corrupt government, as well as on corrupt religious leaders. The government of Judah is said to have made a covenant with death, and the rulers of Samaria are called the drunkards of Ephraim. As I said, the prophet is also scathing in his indictment of religious leaders. A very funny phrase is used twice that is actually unintelligible, although your translation will say something more or less reasonable. Verse 10 makes fun of the priests and prophets who get drunk and then presume to speak in God's name. My translation puts it as, for it is precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. Perhaps an even better translation would be, for it is yada, 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 blah, 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 shambhala anahanda. Considering they're supposed to be speaking the word of the Lord, this is judgment indeed. Finally, our reading turns to the waning days of King Hezekiah, including a prayer from the king himself. It reads like many of the Psalms you have read, lament for what has happened, a prayer for mercy recalled, and assurance that all will be well. Hezekiah had hope, and he expressed it beautifully. Nothing from him was precept upon precept, line upon line. In his pen, there was no yada, 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 blah, blah, blah.